Reid has filed motions to force votes on moving ahead with a bill to help small high-tech companies and a judicial nomination. Votes on those are expected tomorrow. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Black will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty and eternal God, we desire to honor your holy name. Thank you for blessing us to see the sunlight of a new day. Today, lift the minds of our lawmakers above the things that distract them from doing your will. May their hearts be fully focused on fulfilling your purposes as they strive to live for your glory. Lord, give them the wisdom to use all their powers to serve you, seeking your approval for each critical decision they make. Let your favor delight them and your presence sustain them in every season of life. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., May 3, 2011. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jeanne Shaheen, a senator from the state of New Hampshire, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Following any leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 5 p.m. this evening. Republicans will control the first 30 minutes. The majority will control the next 30 minutes. The Senate will recess from 12:30 to 2:15 to allow for weekly caucus meetings. We expect to have a roll call vote this afternoon on adoption of a resolution commending the armed forces and the intelligence community regarding the death of bin Laden. Senators will be notified when that vote is scheduled. Additionally, there's a Senators only briefing today. It's classified on the U.S. operation that killed Osama bin Laden. It will be at 5 p.m. today in the Visitors Center. CI Director Leon Panetta will be there. Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff James Cartwright will be there. National Counterterrorism Center Director Michael Leiter will be there, and Deputy Secretary of State James Steinberg. Last night I filed cloture on the Small Business Jobs Bill, S-493. Senators should expect a cloture vote to occur tomorrow morning. I ask consent that the filing deadline for all first degree amendments be at 2:30 p.m. today for S-493.
Without objection.
Additionally, I also filed cloture on the nomination of John McConnell of Rhode Island to be a district judge for the District of Rhode Island. This vote may also occur tomorrow morning. Mr. President, the bill before this body today, Small Business Innovation Bill, is the latest in a series of bills we've written to help small businesses grow. It supports a research and development program. The Small Business Innovation Research Program has helped tens of thousands of small businesses create jobs and shape the future. And this bill is an adaptation of the bill that President Reagan created 30 years ago. It's a continuation of that program. It's been proven that these investments work. They've helped get great new ideas off the ground. For example, Madam President, the electric toothbrush was invented with a small business grant. The satellite antenna that helped our first responders in Haiti to technologies that keep our food safe and our military tanks from overheating in the desert. These are all a result of what this legislation has done over the years. There are success stories in virtually every state and nearly every industry. Before the recess, we spent days working on an agreement to have votes on 3 amendments to this bill so we can move forward and finally pass it. We have voted on many amendments. This legislation started on March 10th. It's now the first part of May. Now we've had some breaks in time because we're going back to our states, but there's no excuse for not completing this important legislation. Every time we get one problem taken care of, another Republican raises their head, and the latest is Senator Snowe. Of all people who should understand the importance of small business, it's a senator from Maine who was at one time chairman of the Small Business Committee. Yet she has been unmoving and wanting a vote on a piece of legislation that hasn't even had a hearing. The chairman of the Small Business Committee said that she's happy to work with Senator Snowe. Senator Landrieu said she will work with her, hold hearings, whatever is appropriate. But, Madam President, this is unfair. We've not been able to move forward on this bill. As I indicated, we spent days before the recess working on an agreement to have votes on amendments to move this bill forward. Included in this agreement were Senator Cornyn's amendment, which would establish a commission on government waste. Senator Hutchinson's amendment, which is related to health care reform litigation. This agreement was objected to by Senator Snowe. Everyone else in the Senate had signed off on it. During the course of many weeks debating this bill, we've made significant efforts to accommodate Senator Snowe and the rest of the Republican caucus on amendments. She's had one. We voted on it already. We even had a vote on, as indicated, on an amendment offered by Senator Snowe, as well as many other Republican amendments, nearly every one of which had nothing to do with the underlying legislation. Nothing to do with it. They weren't relevant. They weren't germane. In light of our accommodation of extraneous amendments, it's difficult for me to understand why we can't finish debate on this bill. We've been more than fair. We should be able to reach agreement on considering the remaining amendments and voting on final passage. I would hope that my friends on the other side of the aisle would recognize how unfair it is that one senator would hold up this legislation. There are amendments pending, I repeat, that aren't germane or relevant to this piece of legislation. We're willing to take votes on those. And it would seem to me that senators like Cornyn and Hutchinson, who we've worked hard to get votes on, should vote with us on our ability to move forward on this legislation. We should be able to get this done. It's the right thing for the country. But it appears that we're not going to be able to do that. So I had no choice but to file cloture in order to bring this debate to a close. And that's what I did last night. If this job-producing legislation is not passed, there's only one problem with it, and that's been the Republicans on this side of the aisle. It's unfair, Madam President, that we've worked so hard to get this important piece of legislation done, and because of one senator, it's not going to happen. I hope that's wrong. I hope my prediction is wrong. This has been on the floor for far too long. We need to resolve it so we can move to other matters. Would the chair announce morning business, please?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the only until 5 p.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the first hour equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first 30 minutes and the majority controlling the next 30 minutes.
Madam President.
The Senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about a piece of legislation which will be both a bill that Senator Graham and Senator DeMint and I will introduce tomorrow, and an amendment that I have filed to the small business bill on behalf of the three of us. We're calling it the Right to Work Protection Act, and it's our intent to preserve the right of each and have an ability to enforce it. This is in direct response to an action that the National Labor Relations Board has taken against the Boeing Company and the plant that they are building in South Carolina. The National Labor Relations Board has moved to stop Boeing from building airplanes at a non-union plant in South Carolina, suggesting that a unionized American company cannot expand its operations into one of 22 states with right-to-work laws. These laws protect a worker's right to join or not to join a union. In fact, New Hampshire's legislature has just approved its becoming the 23rd such state. This reminds me, this incident by the National Labor Relations Board reminds me of a White House dinner in February 1979 when I was governor of Tennessee. The occupant of the chair has been to those dinners. The president has them every year. The only ones invited are the governors themselves and spouses, and for me it was always one of the highlights of the year. So my first such dinner was with President Carter in 1979. And as a new governor, I was paying close attention to what the President of the United States had to say. And this is what he said. He said, "Governors, go to Japan. Persuade them to make here what they sell here." Well, I had walked 1,000 miles across Tennessee to be governor the year before. And I don't suspect one single Tennessean had said to me, "Well, Lamar, the first thing you do when you get in office is go to Japan." That was not on our minds. But it was tough economic times. Not many people were investing anywhere in the United States at that time. And I thought, well, if the President of the United States says, governors, go to Japan, persuade them to make here what they sell here, that I should do that. Make sure what they sell here was then the union battle cry. It was part of an effort to slow the tide of Japanese cars and trucks entering the U.S. market. At that time, Americans were very worried about Japan. There were books about Japan being #1, and the fear was that Japan would overwhelm us economically. And the cars and trucks from Japan were fuel efficient, they were attractive, they were selling, and manufacturers and the United Auto Workers here were concerned that we'd lose a lot of jobs. And so the cry was to the Japanese, if you're going to make it in the United States, if you're going to sell it in the United States, you need to make it in the United States. So off I went to Tokyo to meet with the Nissan executives who were then deciding where to put their first United States manufacturing plant. At that time, Japan had very few manufacturing plants in the United States. They made there what they sold here. I carried with me on that trip a photograph taken at night from a satellite showing the country with all of its lights on. Try to visualize that, because what you see if you look at a photograph of the United States at night are a lot of lights east of the Mississippi River, but it's pretty dark almost until you get to California, and there are a lot of lights down around Texas. So I was trying to make a point, and the Japanese executives who didn't know very much about Tennessee, and I didn't know very much about Japan, would say to me, "Where is Tennessee?" And I would point to our state and say, we are right in the middle of the lights. My argument, of course, was that locating a plant in the population center of the United States would reduce the cost of transporting cars to customers. That population center 70 or 80 years ago was in the Midwest, where the American automobile was literally invented. And it made a lot of sense to build almost all the plants there because transportation costs were less when you send these heavy cars and trucks to the customers, so you locate your plant near the population center. But gradually, that population center migrated south from the Midwest, where most U.S. plants have been, to Kentucky and Tennessee. Then the Japanese, to whom I was talking, examined a second decision. Tennessee had a right-to-work law, and Kentucky did not. That meant that in Kentucky, workers would have to join the United Auto Workers Union. Workers in Tennessee had a choice. In 1980, Nissan chose Tennessee, a state then with almost no auto jobs. Today, auto assembly plants and suppliers provide 1/3 of our state's manufacturing jobs. Tennessee is home for the production of the Leaf, Nissan's all-electric vehicle, and the batteries that power it. I'm happy to report it works well. I bought one, parked in the garage of the apartment where I live here. Recently, Nissan announced that 85% of the cars and trucks that it sells in the United States will be made in the United States, making it one of the largest so-called American auto companies and nearly fulfilling Mr. Carter's request of 30 years ago. But now unions want to make it illegal for a company that has experienced repeated strikes to move production to a state with a right-to-work law. What would this mean for the future of American auto jobs? Jobs would flee overseas as manufacturers look for a competitive environment in which to make and sell cars around the world. It's happened before. David Halberstam's 1986 book, The Reckoning, about the decline of the American auto industry tells the story. Halberstam quotes American Motors President George Romney, who criticized the shared monopoly, quote, consisting of the big three Detroit auto manufacturers and the United Auto Workers. Romney warned, quote, there's nothing more vulnerable than entrenched success. Detroit ignored upstarts like Nissan, who in the 1960s began selling funny little cars to American customers. We all know what happened to employment in the big three companies. Even when Detroit sought greener pastures and a right-to-work state, its partnership with the United Auto Workers could not compete. In 1985, General Motors located its $5 billion Saturn plant in Spring Hill, Tennessee, 40 miles from Nissan, hoping side-by-side competition would help the Americans beat the Japanese. After 25 years, non-union Nissan operated the most efficient plant in North America. The Saturn-UAW partnership never made a profit. Last year, GM closed Saturn. Nissan's success is one reason why Volkswagen recently located in Chattanooga, and why Honda, Toyota, BMW, Kia, Mercedes-Benz, Hyundai, and thousands of suppliers have chosen southeastern right-to-work states for their plants. Under right-to-work laws, employees may join unions, but mostly they've declined. 3 times, workers at the Nissan plant in Smyrna, Tennessee, rejected organizing themselves like Saturn employees a few miles away. Our goal should be to make it easier and cheaper to create private sector jobs in this country. Giving workers the right to join or not to join a union helps to create a competitive environment in which more manufacturers like Nissan can make here 85% of what they sell here. Madam President, I would like to ask unanimous consent to place in the record the bill and the amendment that I and Senator Graham and Senator DeMint will be introducing as a bill tomorrow, and which we filed as an amendment today. I would like to...
Without objection.
Thank you. And I'd like to add, I saw today a representative of the Whirlpool Company, which has 2,500 employees in Tennessee. He said that Whirlpool makes 82% of what they sell in the United States here in the United States, but that they have a choice. They have plants in Mexico as well. One more example of why allowing states to have a right-to-work law keeps jobs in our country. Now, Madam President, I see on the floor Senator DeMint, whose state is directly affected by this NLRB decision. He and I are working together on this legislation, and I'm sure that he has comments on the legislation and on the decision of the NLRB.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. And I do want to associate myself with the Senator from Tennessee. I appreciate him bringing this issue up. It's really important for us here in the Senate as well as everyone around the country to understand what this administration is doing to hurt jobs in America. This has been a good week for America. We worked together, building on one of the common principles of our country of a strong defense and robust intelligence system to track down an enemy of freedom and to render justice as we had promised. This was done over 2 administrations and many congressmen and senators. So this is a good day for America, and I think we need to take this time to maybe think about how we can apply the principles that work in America to our challenges back home with our economy and our jobs and our culture. Because it really is a bigger issue that we're dealing with in the context of this decision by the National Labor Relations Board. We need to use the principles that work, but it appears that this administration, my colleagues on the other side, are afraid to let these principles work. They seem to be afraid of freedom itself. We see in their record over the last 2 years of being afraid for Americans to make their own decisions about their children's education, about their health care. They're afraid to death of letting senior citizens manage their own retirement funds and health care plans. They're certainly afraid to let states manage their own energy resources or decide what roads and bridges to build and where to build them. They clearly don't want businesses to make their own decisions about hiring and firing. They won't let even community banks make their own decisions about who to lend money to, even though these small banks had nothing to do with the financial collapse. And clearly from this decision, this administration and the Democrat Party is afraid to give employees, workers, the freedom not to join a union. It's really amazing what this Labor Relations Board that's been stacked with union folks by the administration is doing to jobs in our state and all across the country. 22 states have right-to-work laws. In the last few months, my state, along with several others, have passed a constitutional amendment that would protect the freedom of workers to have a secret ballot when union bosses are trying to organize their workplace. The secret ballot is so fundamental to American principles and the principles of freedom, but the AFL-CIO is suing our state and others to stop us from protecting that freedom of workers. In the last few weeks, a truly extraordinary thing has happened as this National Labor Relations Board has actually filed suit against Boeing, who has located a new facility in South Carolina, claiming it was retribution for a strike in Washington. Now, people need to understand that Boeing has added 2,000 jobs in Washington since they decided to build this new production line in South Carolina. But this administration, and I'm afraid the majority here in the Senate, is so afraid that companies will have the freedom to locate new facilities, new businesses, in states where their workers are not required to join a union. Now, let's put this in a different context. A few weeks ago, a delegation from California went to Texas to try to figure out why hundreds of businesses are moving from California, taking tax revenue and jobs with them to Texas and other states. They didn't really need to make the trip. It was pretty obvious that the business environment that has been created in California by the unions and the politicians has made it very difficult for world-class companies to be competitive. What takes a few weeks in Texas could take 2 years as far as getting a permit to open a new business. Now, this is just a small look at what's happening to our country, because we need to look at why so many companies are moving from our country to other countries to do business. And it's because of decisions like this and decisions by this administration over the last couple of years that have made America a place that is very difficult to do business in. I appreciate what the senator from Tennessee is doing, because this is not just about one employer or one state. 22 states are right-to-work states. 22 states have decided that they're going to provide the freedom of their workers not to have to join a union. So much of this is political and retribution, not just against Boeing for putting a site in a right-to-work state, but it's political retribution. And the administration, I believe, is acting like thugs that you might see in a third-world country trying to bully and intimidate employers who are trying to get out from under this cloud of union control. It's a political deal of this administration trying to expand unionization and union benefits because the unions give the contributions to the Democrat Party and get out the vote for the Democrats. This is crazy. In an environment where this administration and all of us here are saying we're trying to create jobs, there's no question what they're doing in South Carolina and around this country by trying to force unionization is hurting our business climate in America, it's hurting employment, and it's diminishing our future as a country. And it's all for political purposes. It's amazing to see that the unions have such a control over this administration. Even in passing the stimulus bill, with it went requirements that a lot of the contractors who use this money had to follow union rules or be unionized. We saw in the health care plan, the unions were the big proponent of it. But as soon as it passed, they're the ones asking for waivers so that they don't have to live by it. What this administration is doing to one company is a threat to every company, every employer, and every worker in this country. And it goes back to their fear of freedom. The command and control paranoia that we see in this administration is antithetical to everything that we understand about freedom in our country, of individual responsibility and individual freedom, and free markets and free enterprise. They're attacking it on every front. And this decision by the National Labor Relations Board cannot stand. We must challenge it here in the Congress. Employers need to challenge it. States are already challenging it because it's clearly outside of the authority of this federal government to be threatening and bullying and trying to intimidate companies like Boeing, who should have the freedom to locate their plants anywhere they want. And this is intimidation. Many of Boeing's contracts are military contracts, and we know that's being held over their head. This is not the way we should do business in America. This is not the way our government should operate. We need to get back to those first principles that made us great. And clearly what this administration is doing in this case, and many others, is way outside the realm of what we should expect of a good and decent government. And we're not getting it here. With that, Madam President, I see that the other senator from South Carolina is here, and I'll yield to him.
Thank you.
Senator from South Carolina.
One, I'd like to thank my colleague from South Carolina who has been terrific trying to bring reason to this issue. Senator Mint has been a very strong voice for free enterprise, and this is really what this is all about. To Senator Alexander from Tennessee, thank you for listening to what's going on in South Carolina and understanding this is just not about our state, it's about the nation as a whole. And the Right to Work Protection Act, I think, is a very solid piece of legislation that's going to serve the country as a whole. When a state chooses to be a right-to-work state, what does that mean? That means that no one can be forced to join a union. The union can ask for your vote. If you say no, that's your decision to make. And if the group says yes, you don't have to join. A lot of states, that's not true. If the 51% of the workforce or 60% of the workforce says that we're going to go union, everybody else is drafted whether they want to be or not. So the concept of right to work is really at stake here. And I do appreciate this legislation because it would preserve the ability of a state to go down that road without suffering at the federal level. It would prohibit federal government contracts, federal government action from punishing a state that chose to adopt right-to-work laws. And that's why Senator Alexander's legislation is so important. We're not making anyone become a right-to-work state. We're saying if you choose to do that, your federal government and the NLRB and other organizations of the federal government cannot use that against you. We're protecting that status. And I think that is the balanced approach to this dilemma we face. Now, what is this dilemma? Boeing is one of the great companies in the world. They have a history of producing terrific airplanes. They've been located in Washington for decades. And as a South Carolinian who is very happy Boeing has come to South Carolina, I want to acknowledge the Washington workforce is one of the best in the world. And we hope to build great airplanes in South Carolina. But the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that my complaint or concerns are not with the people of Washington, not with the workforce in Washington. It's with the actions of the NLRB and this complaint filed by the Machinists Union. So I hope to be in partnership with our colleagues from the state of Washington and the Senate and House side to pursue good policies that not only be good for Boeing but for the country as a whole. And South Carolina is going to enjoy the status of being a teammate with the people of Washington when it comes to trying to help Boeing and manufacturing in general. But what happened, Madam President, is that in October of 2009, Boeing decided to create a second assembly plant in South Carolina. This is a new assembly plant because the orders for the 787 were so large, it necessitated building a second line. And Boeing, under the contract with the Machinists Union, reserved in that contract the right to locate new business wherever they thought it would be best for Boeing. They negotiated with the people in Seattle about producing the second line in Seattle, and they went all over the country looking for other locations to create a second line. They came to South Carolina, and I can assure you, after a lot of negotiations, the reason they chose South Carolina because it was the best business deal for Boeing. They negotiated in Washington. They negotiated everywhere in the country, really, that they thought they could do good business. And South Carolina won out. There's criticism back home that the package that we gave Boeing was too generous. So I can assure you this was a legitimate business deal. And the idea that moving to South Carolina somehow was retaliation that violated the National Labor Relations Act, Section 883, is legally absurd. Under that act, a company cannot retaliate against a group of employees or a location that decides to unionize. And you would have to prove in a retaliation complaint that the people suffered. Well, in this case, not one person in Puget Sound or in the state of Washington lost their job. Because of the additional business being generated in South Carolina, 2,000 people have been hired in the state of Washington. Not one benefit was cut from the workforce in Washington. Nobody's pay was cut. Nobody's benefits were reduced because they moved to South Carolina. So this complaint is just frivolous. It is motivated by all the wrong reasons. And let's just for a moment assume that it's granted and this is the new business model. It would mean basically that if you decide to do work in a union plant, you're locked into that location forever. You could never move. That's crazy. That's not what the law is all about. The law prevents retaliation, and that's a specific concept in the law, and none of the factors that would lead to that conclusion exist in this case. There is new work. No one lost a job. This is a new line of business, and we're arguing about the right of a company to be able to make a business decision when it comes to new production. And that's why this complaint, if it ever gets to federal court, will fail. And it's just sad that Boeing may have to spend millions of dollars defending themselves against what I think is a very frivolous complaint. But let me tell you a little bit about, to my colleagues, if you're wondering about this, here's something I want to put on the table for you to consider. One of the members of the Boeing board, at the time they chose to come to South Carolina, after a lot of negotiations in different places, including Washington and South Carolina, one of the board members who approved the second assembly line in South Carolina was Bill Daley, the Chief of Staff of the President of the United States. At the time, he wasn't Chief of Staff. He was a member of the Boeing board, and they voted unanimously to move the second, to not move, but to create a second assembly plant in the state of South Carolina. I would argue that Mr. Daley, when he cast that vote, understood it was best for Boeing to make this decision to locate new business, and he did not believe he was violating the law or retaliating against unions. One thing you can say about the Daley family, it's not in their DNA to retaliate against unions. So this is in 2009. In March of 2010, the Machinists Union files this complaint with the NLRB. Now, the General Counsel, the person holding that title a few weeks ago, submitted the complaint to the board. But the story is even more interesting. In March of 2010, the complaint is filed by the Machinists Union. The vote to come to South Carolina was in October 2009. In January of 2011, Mr. Daley was chosen to be President Obama's Chief of Staff, a decision that I supported and thought was a good decision for the administration and the country as a whole, because Mr. Daley is a Democrat, but he is a very well-respected member of the business community, someone who has a lot of skill and talent, and the President chose wisely. I would assume that in the vetting process, they looked at Mr. Daley's record of involvement in business and other matters. I'm assuming that the vetting team knew that the complaint had been filed by the Machinists Union in March of 2010, and that Mr. Daley voted, along with the rest of the members of the board, to come to South Carolina, and they must have concluded that this complaint was frivolous. I assume that because if they didn't know about the complaint, that was one of the worst vetting jobs in the history of the world. And if they thought he did engage in illegal activity, that made no sense to hire him. So to my colleagues, I want you to consider the fact that Mr. Daley, the current Chief of Staff, voted to come to South Carolina. And after he voted, a year and a half later, he was chosen to be the Chief of Staff of the President of the United States. The Boeing CEO, Jim McNerney, was chosen by President Obama to lead his export council to create jobs for Americans by looking at export opportunities. I would argue that President Obama would not have chosen Mr. McNerney if he thought he led an effort to retaliate against Washington unions. All I can say, this complaint is frivolous. It is taking time and money away from creating jobs in South Carolina and Washington, and it has national implications. And to Senator Alexander, you found the right way for the Congress to address this. We're not forcing anybody to be a member of a union. We're just saying if a state like South Carolina and Tennessee chooses to be a right-to-work state, that cannot be held against them. This legislation would say to the country and the business community as a whole, when you look at where to locate, you can consider a right-to-work state without violating the law. That is an important concept. And I can assure you that Boeing came to South Carolina because it was the best business deal. That they had a lot of choices. They chose South Carolina not to retaliate, but to create a second line. And here's the logic of it. Would you put everything you own in one location in today's world? So the idea they expanded the second plant in a different state in a different location makes perfect sense. The fact that South Carolina is a low-cost right-to-work state, I'm sure they considered. But under the law, no one in Washington lost one benefit they had. No one in Washington lost a job they already had with Boeing. The goal of this decision by Boeing is to grow their company. If we do well in South Carolina, Boeing does well in Washington. This complaint is dangerous. This complaint is a dangerous road to go down. This complaint is politics at its worst. The law is designed to protect us, and it is being abused in my view. Politics is about 50+1. The law is something that should protect us all. And this complaint filed by the General Counsel at the NLRB sets a dangerous precedent, and the Congress should speak, the administration should speak out and say this is frivolous. They're an independent agency. Nobody can tell them what to do, but we have an independent duty to speak out in a constructive way. Senator Alexander's legislation is the appropriate way to address this issue. And I want to thank him on behalf of the people of South Carolina and the country as a whole, and I look forward to working with him to have this passed. And to my colleagues on the other side, what's going on in this complaint is dangerous for us all, not just South Carolina. With that, I yield the floor.
The senator's time has expired. Senator from Ohio.
I rise and will be joined in a few moments by Senator Harkin, who is the chair of the Health Education Labor Pension Committee, Senator Murray, chair of the Veterans Committee, and Senator Blumenthal, a new member of the Senate from Connecticut. Each of them has, especially Senator Harkin, has devoted their careers to worker rights, worker safety, decent benefits, pensions, creating, in short, in creating a middle class. And their efforts have been legion, all four of them, and all three of them, in doing that. I rise today to commemorate Workers' Memorial Day. Last Thursday, April 28th, our nation observed Workers' Memorial Day, and it's an occasion for us to pause and remember those Americans who've lost their jobs who've lost their lives while on the job. I wear on my lapel a pin given to me at a Workers' Memorial Day rally in Lorain, Ohio, a city west of Cleveland on Lake Erie, a steel town, people like to call us. And this lapel pin I wear is a depiction of a canary in a bird cage. We know the mine workers 100 years ago took a canary down in the mines. If the canary died from lack of oxygen or toxic gas, the mine worker knew he had to get out of the mine. He had to depend on himself. He had no union strong enough, nor a government which cared enough to protect him in those days. And as we celebrate Workers' Memorial Day, we look back at the progress we made as a country. This year is the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. That tragedy claimed the lives of 146 workers, 123 women, 23 men, while they labored in sweatshop conditions in this textile plant in New York City. They were mostly young immigrants who came to this country in pursuit of a better life. Instead, they were killed because of the workplace and the incredibly unsafe conditions in that workplace. That tragedy marked a significant turning point in the struggle to advance worker rights and safety in our country. The day after the fire, 15,000 shirtwaist workers walked off the job demanding a 20% pay raise and a 52-hour week they were demanding. 52-hour week. Nearly 20 years later, in 1930, Ohio experienced its deadliest mine explosion in our history, the Millified mine disaster in Athens County. Methane gases were ignited by a short circuit between a trolley wire and rail, killing more than 80 men. 4 years later, in 1934, thousands of workers stood up to the Electric Autolite Company in Toledo, Ohio. Workers recognized they were underpaid and undervalued. They went on strike. They clashed with members of the Ohio National Guard. The so-called Battle of Toledo resulted in 2 deaths and 200 injuries. The strike brought together union brothers and sisters across the city fighting for middle-class rights. Similar strikes in Minneapolis and San Francisco followed the one in Toledo, generating a new momentum across our country toward treating U.S. workers with respect. Moving, ultimately, we know what happened. It's why we have a 40-hour work week. It's why we have a minimum wage. It's why we have collective bargaining rights. Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act in 1935, which guaranteed workers the right to form a union and bargain collectively. The Labor Standards Act passed in 1938. It established a minimum wage, guaranteed overtime pay for certain jobs, established record-keeping standards, created child labor protections. We know in OSHA, the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, signed by a Republican president. In those days, Republicans worked with Democrats to increase worker safety standards and actually to help workers join the middle class. The OSHA established 41 years ago. In that year, In 1970, 38 workers died on the job in this country every day. We have cut that worker death rate by 2/3, not just because of OSHA, but certainly in large part because of OSHA. But the deaths in the workplace continue, not with the frequency as 100 years ago or even 50 years ago prior to OSHA, but they do continue. Just last week, a mine accident claimed the life of Jason Gudat, who was killed while working an underground limestone mine in eastern Ohio, in Salem. This past year, I received a letter from Crystal of Adams County, who lost her husband Terry in a construction accident. Terry was a father of 5. He was killed on his construction job last year due to a lack of safety lighting during his nighttime shift. His widow said in her letter the circumstances of his death were completely preventable if there had been better safety laws regarding his line of work. There is no lighting where my husband lost his job. You never realize how important those things are until it happens to you. In the case of garment workers, it was basic fire safety. In the case of mine workers like Jason, it was the unsafe conditions too often found in mines. In the case of Terry and other construction workers, it was basic safety lighting. We ask our workers to build our roads, to make our cars, to produce our energy, to serve as the backbone of our nation's economic competitiveness. We should do more to protect them while they do so. Mr. President, or Madam President, last month, I had a roundtable meeting with a group of workers in Columbus and State House Square in an Episcopal church right off the square. We were talking about worker rights. We were talking about, I had a police officer there, a firefighter there, a nurse, a teacher, several other workers. These were public employees, but they have seen the same assault on their rights as we're seeing all too often in this body, an assault on union rights, an assault on non-union worker rights far too many times. We must stop these blatant efforts to strip teachers and sanitation workers and police officers and firefighters of the right to collectively bargaining. The right to collectively bargaining. It's been a right in this country for 75 years, since the Wagner Act and the 1938 Labor Act. It's been a right for workers that has created a middle class that has brought up living standards, not just for union workers who do organize and bargain collectively, but has brought up the living standards for white-collar workers and blue-collar workers, for management, for labor, throughout the society, has created a much more prosperous society. The New York Times had an article written last week by someone who said, when we fail at war in a battle, we don't turn around and blame the soldiers. We give the soldiers better equipment to do their jobs. So why, when our public education system sometimes fails, is not what we want it to, why do we blame the teachers? Why don't we instead give those teachers better ability to do their jobs, better tools to do their jobs? Why don't we do the same with firefighters? Why don't we do the same with police officers and nurses and others, instead of blaming these workers and blaming these public employees? In my state, the governor signed legislation just a month or so ago that stripped these public workers of collective bargaining rights. And I think in this society, with this kind of pressure on the middle class, the last thing we should do is strip anybody of their rights that enable them to make a decent living, to put food on their table, to have a decent pension, a decent health care, especially in their retirement. Madam President, it makes no sense to me, as we honor workers on Workers' Memorial Day that was commemorated last week, that we would ever move in the wrong direction when it comes to workers' rights, when it comes to building a prosperous middle class. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Iowa.
Madam President, I just want to join with my good friend, the Senator from Ohio, Senator Brown, in commemorating the Workers' Memorial Day, which actually was last week, but since we weren't in session, we wanted to take the time today to commemorate the Workers' Memorial Day. And I'm always greatly appreciative of my friends wearing the canary pin on his lapel. because, as the senator knows, my father was a coal miner for over 20 years. A lot of people still don't know that we had coal mines in Iowa. But at one time, back in those days, Iowa was the third largest coal-producing state in the nation. So my father worked for over 20 years in coal mines, long time ago, before there were any safety laws or anything like that. In fact, most of the time he worked in those mines was even before I was born. But I can remember later on him telling stories about the mines and how many people would get injured and killed, and it was just sort of a accepted thing that every day, you know, every week, month, people would just die and cave-ins would happen. And of course, almost every one of his generation that worked in those coal mines eventually got miner's cough, as they called it then, miner's lung, as we know it as black lung disease now. Almost virtually all of them had that later on in their lives. So I just want to appreciate my friend from Ohio in commemorating Workers' Memorial Day. Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that Blake Tice, Taylor, Emily Wee, and Lene Gruber of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's proceedings.
Without objection.
Madam President, more than 20 years ago, family members of workers killed on the job joined with safety advocates to launch Workers' Memorial Day, a day of remembrance and advocacy, to honor the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA as it's called. April 28th was chosen as Workers' Memorial Day. This year, that day took on special significance because it marked the 40th anniversary of the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The passage of the Occupational Safety and Safety Act, which created OSHA, was one of the monumental legislative achievements of the 20th century. This landmark legislation reflects the values that all Americans share, that workers shouldn't have to risk their lives to earn their livelihood, that workers, employers, and the government must all work together to keep people safe and healthy on the job. Signed into law by President Nixon, this bipartisan legislation has been a tremendous success, saving the lives and the health of hundreds of thousands of American workers. Here's the facts. Immediately prior to the creation of OSHA in 1970, an average of 14,000 workers died annually from occupational injuries. In 2009, despite a workforce that is twice as large as the workforce in 1970, 4,340 workers were killed on the job. Before OSHA, about 11 workers were killed for every 100,000 people working. Now, roughly 3.3 workers are killed per 100,000 people working. Now, again, these figures are still too large, and we absolutely can and must do better. But we should also take a moment to reflect on how many tragedies have been prevented and how many lives have been saved because of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. I fear that this simple truth, that workplace safety regulations has been a phenomenal success, is being ignored in Washington these days. Nowadays, some people would have us believe that workplace safety regulation is something bad. They claim that OSHA standards are, quote, job killers. But just because some special interest groups with highly paid lobbyists keep repeating this absurd mantra, that doesn't mean it's true. In fact, just the opposite is true. Smart regulations, smart safety regulations administered by active, unbiased regulators improve and stabilize our economy. They save workers' lives, prevent catastrophic accidents, reduce health care costs, and ensure that industries are responsible for their actions instead of just dumping the cost of their mistakes on workers and taxpayers. In addition to the more than 4,000 workers killed on the job every year, which I just mentioned, almost 50,000 Americans die every year from occupational illnesses. Let me repeat that. Almost 50,000 Americans die every year from occupational illnesses, and more than 4.1 million workers are injured every year. The cost of these injuries and illnesses is enormous, estimated at somewhere between $160 billion to $318 billion a year for the direct and the indirect costs of disabling injuries. Additional safeguards to prevent these injuries and illnesses, along with stronger enforcement of existing laws, would save thousands of lives, save thousands of injuries from happening, and save the taxpayers billions of dollars. To accomplish this, it's clear that our safety laws need to be updated. They need to be updated. We have learned much in the 40 years since the Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed, and it's past time to use this knowledge for meaningful reform. For example, we know that whistleblowers are critical to bringing safety problems to light. But these whistleblowers won't come forward unless the law contains stronger protections against retaliation. Right now, we have stronger protections for financial whistleblowers under the Sarbanes-Oxley law than we do for workers blowing the whistle trying to save lives. Let me repeat that. We have stronger whistleblower protections for financial whistleblowers under existing Sarbanes-Oxley financial reform law than we do for workers who are trying to save lives by blowing the whistle. That's not right. That should be corrected. We also know that while most responsible companies make worker safety a top priority, there are some unscrupulous employers that cut corners on safety to save costs. Unfortunately, as a past Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee report demonstrated, when the negligence of these companies results in workers being killed on the job, these irresponsible companies walk away with just a slap on the wrist. OSHA penalties are pitifully low. The average fine for a worker being killed on the job is just $5,000. Let me repeat that. The average fine for an irresponsible company, and then they have to be found that they were not acting prudently, that they were skimping on their safety regulations, they were not adhering to well-defined safety regulations. Someone gets killed, the average fine, $5,000. $5,000. Well, what we need is real penalties to ensure that all employers have real incentives to comply with safety and health laws. These and other changes in the law are desperately overdue, which is why I have consistently sponsored and supported the Protecting America's Workers Act. This bill makes common sense reforms to bring our workplace safety laws into the 21st century with minimal burden on the vast majority of employers that comply with the law. In this Congress, once again, I plan to do everything possible to fight for this important legislation. In addition to these much-needed updates to the Occupational Safety and Health Act, we also must recognize the key role that vigilant enforcement plays in keeping workers safe. Safety laws don't work unless there's a legitimate expectation that they will actually be enforced. In recent years, we have made real progress in ensuring adequate funding for our workplace safety agencies. For example, increases in funding for the Mine Safety and Health Administration in recent years have enabled it to meet mandated safety and health inspections for 3 years in a row. MSHA, as it's called, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and the Department of Labor have funds to attack a backlog of appeals filed by mine operators. These appeals have helped some operators avoid heightened enforcement actions. And OSHA has received funds to restore the number of inspectors that it had over a decade ago. However, we here in the Senate have recently had to fend off efforts to roll back this progress. H.R. 1, the Republican fiscal year, cut the Occupational and Safety Health Administration by 18%. 18%. This would have paralyzed the agency and allowed unscrupulous employers to ignore worker safety and health protections. This bill would have allowed the backlog of mine safety and health citations to increase. It would have prevented MSHA from moving forward on improvements it has initiated in mine emergency response and other areas. Thankfully, Senate Democrats and the President are standing firm and refusing to cut workplace safety funding to finance tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires. As we continue the budget debates, we should keep in mind that the budget reflects moral choices about the kind of country and society we want to be. Personally, I'm committed to upholding the bipartisan values reflected in the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. All Americans have the right to a safe workplace. While we have made tremendous progress, as I pointed out, in the last 40 years under OSHA, there's much more work to be done. Over 4,000 lives lost each year is still unacceptably high. We owe the 4,340 workers we lost just last year our best efforts to ensure that such tragic losses are dramatically reduced, and we should not rest until all of our fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, our friends, our families can go to work each day knowing that they will come home safely again each night. So once again, Madam President, April 28th, we commemorate Workers' Memorial Day, and we renew our commitment to making sure that workers all across America have the protections of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, that we provide the funding for these agencies to make sure that the laws are enforced, and to make sure that we reassure every worker in America that they have a right to a safe workplace. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.